Okay, so Rabbi Isai, what we're going to do is we're just going to continue where we left off. Um, and I just want to back up just slightly so that we get our bearings as far as where we were. What we had started talking about was let's see, we're on the bottom of Zion Amud Aleph. And we had said that the psak is that you have to say Kriya Shema until Chatzos. And then based on that discussion, when you're supposed to say the night Kriya Shema, the Gemara had engaged in a discussion of somehow there's this imperative of saying Kriya Shema immediately before you go to sleep. But Rabbi Yasa mefaked lechavraya. That's where we're up to. It's 6 lines from the bottom on Zion Amud Aleph. He told the Chachamim in his base medrash, Ein be'isun misaska be'oraisa. If you want to study Torah at night, atun Kriya Shema kodem chatzos u'mitaskin. Make sure you recite Kriya Shema before you go to learn in the base medrash, because we're concerned, since you only have until Chatzos to recite Kriya Shema, you may accidentally, get engaged in learning and then go past Chatzos and you'll be past the time you're supposed to recite Kriya Shema.
And the rabbis will say in the Haggadah.
Yeah.
That's the morning.
In the Haggadah, yeah. So Milsei Amra, we can learn from Rabbi Yasa's statement, Shahalacha kechachamim, and that the halacha is like the chachamim, that you only have until midnight to recite the Shema. And Milsei Amra, and you can also learn from his words, Sha'omer devarim la'achar emes v'yatziv, that you are permitted to engage in conversation in between your Kriya Shema that you say before you go to bed and actually falling asleep. Now, why is that a startling, why is that a chiddush? The Gemara is going to be working with the assumption, and we're going to see some sources for this later. And then I want us to see the halacha, actually, as far as what the halacha is. Before you go to bed, we all know you're supposed to say Kriya Shema al Hamida. There's different minhagim. Some say all 3 paragraphs. Some say
paragraphs.
Well, we'll see. There's a basis to say it multiple times. We'll see in just a minute. You can go crazy. If you have OCD, this is a great Gemara for you.
They're still saying it now.
Yeah, right. Because, and you actually have to be careful about these kinds of Gemaras and obsessive compulsive disorder. I actually am dealing with a young man who has OCD, and I persist in telling him, you are exempt from that mitzvah. You're exempt from that mitzvah. You're exempt from that mitzvah, because it triggers your OCD and you're not able to function. So,
what kind of mitzvah did you say that?
Well, this particular young man is obsessed with idolatry. He thinks that if he bends over to pick something up from the ground,
against idolatry.
And there's a photograph of someone.
Oh, I see.
Or there's a painting, or there's
he doesn't want to be over idolatry.
Yeah, and he's got other obsessions which are not for now, but I keep telling him there's no prohibition of idolatry nowadays. It doesn't exist, and certainly not for you. And and these types, we're gonna see some Gemaras. Okay, so anyway, you're allowed to engage in conversation after MS V'yatziv. And the way that we had explained MS V'yatziv, even though at Ma'ariv, what do we say after Kriya Shema? We don't say MS V'yatziv, we say MS Ve'emuna. But in the times of when this Yerushalmi is being written, they were saying MS V'yatziv alternatively, both in the morning and in the night after Kriya Shema. And it could be a reference to the blessing after Kriya Shema in Ma'ariv, which ends with Shomer Amo Yisrael La'ad, and just started with the first few lines of that bracha. Now let's go further. Tani, Hakorei et Shema beveit hakneset b'shachar yatsa yedei chovasa. This brings us to the next discussion. When you recite Kriya Shema in the Beis HaKnesses, in the shul, in the morning, you fulfill your obligation. Now, why would I think I wouldn't fulfill my obligation? Well, the answer is that, as we'll see later on, for the morning Kriya Shema, there are optimal times to recite the Shema, and there are less optimal times. But the point of the Gemara is, let's say you go to a regular minyan every day, and you're within a certain parameter of acceptability, you don't have to worry about reciting Kriya Shema again. You've said it in the morning, even though it may not be the optimal time to say it, but you've said it and you're Yotzei. But Erev lo Yatsa Yedei Chovasa. But if you daven Ma'ariv in shul and you recite Kriya Shema, then you do not fulfill your obligation. Now, why is that? Because the minhag, when this Gemara is being written, was that they would daven Ma'ariv early. Now, why would they daven Ma'ariv early?
The fields being safe.
Safety. They were worried about safety issues. Now, some could say safety from wild animals, safety from people, or safety from mazikim. What are mazikim? The heebie-jeebies, yeah. the demonic forces. Okay. But in any event, people avoided going out at night. It's not like, you wanted to find out, well, which kosher restaurants, or let's go catch a movie, right? When your workday was done, you went home to your family, you lit the hearth, whatever a hearth is, whatever the fireplace, and you opened up your sefer, and that's where you would learn. Sometimes people would go to the Beis Medrash, but apparently the Beis Medrash was in the Yishuv, it was within the settlement, so you didn't have to travel far from home. So
the shuls wouldn't be?
The farmers generally would gather to daven, and usually the Beis HaKnesses is near home as well.
Yeah.
So it sort of stands to, the question becomes, why did they accommodate the farming trends and so forth? But in any event,
Right.
the custom was that they would daven Ma'ariv while it was still daytime, and therefore you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah of reciting Kriya Shema. Why then did they recite Kriya Shema in Ma'ariv? Because it was instituted in Ma'ariv. Why was it instituted in Ma'ariv, even though you're going to have to recite it later? So we're gonna talk all about the structure of prayer as we go along through this,
Same as when we daven
through these gemaras. It's the very same thing. So ma bein hakore b'shacharis u'ma bein hakore ba'arvis. So the Gemara says, why is it that in the morning they arrange minyan so that you can fulfill your mitzvah of Kriya Shema by davening shacharis at the appropriate time? And why is it that at Ma'ariv they gather in the Beis HaKnesses at a time where you cannot fulfill your mitzvah of Kriya Shema? So here the commentaries are a little bit disturbed. It's obvious why they davened early, because people didn't go out at night. So some say, well, there could have been other accommodations. Maybe we could have arranged minyanim closer to home, and people could have davened Ma'ariv that way. Or it could also be that the language is strange. Don't tell me that you're not Yotzei Ma'ariv in the Beis HaKnesses. Say that you're not Yotzei Ma'ariv unless you recite it at night. The language itself is what the Gemara may be questioning. So Rav Huna b'shem Rav Yosef, so Rav Huna says, Ma tam amru sha'adam tzarech likro shema beveso ba'erev. In other words, what the Gemara is suggesting is, why is it that the rabbi said that in addition to the Kriya Shema that you recite in Ma'ariv, you have to say it Kriya Shema a second time at night in the evening, bishvil lahavriach et hamazikin, because you have to chase away the mazikin, the spiritual injurious forces, the shadim, the demons. And the way that the Gemara is suggesting, if you look at what the text over here in the art scroll, shetzarech lekora al mitaso kidei lahavriach es hamazikim. You have to read it on your bed right before you go to bed to chase away the shadim. Hamitzuyim b'layla bisman hashena, that can be found at night before you go to bed. V'lachein afilu imkara eshema bismana, and therefore, what the Gemara is suggesting is, even if you were to find a way to daven Ma'ariv at nighttime, you still would have to recite it again. And that's really what the Gemara is getting at. The Gemara is basically saying it's not the reason why you have to repeat Kriya Shema is not only because when you davened Ma'ariv, it was still daytime. Even if you managed to daven Ma'ariv at the right time, you still have to repeat Kriya Shema right before you go to bed. Tzarach lachzor v'likrota beveso lifnei Hashem. You have to go back and repeat it before you go to bed.
Was our reason today a little bit different? Like, do we still concern ourselves with the shading? I don't think we're going to do that.
We still do concern ourselves with shading. Yeah, to a certain degree. What you're getting at, Ron, is an interesting discussion. The Gemara in Psachim says that in the times of Abaya, who was an Amora, who presumably came after this conversation that we're having here, he banished all of the shadim to the wilderness, so that shadim are no longer prevalent in inhabited areas.
They listen to him?
He was a pretty powerful guy. You didn't mess with Abaya.
Bill was not obsessed with this, right?
What's that?
Bill was not obsessed with Shadim.
Bavel was totally obsessed with shadim. Bavel was probably even more obsessed with shadim than Eretz Yisrael was, because of so many of the Persian influences and the Babylonian influences. There are so many supernatural influences, superstitious influences in Bavel, to the point where many of the practices in Bavel are not even recorded in the Bavli. The rabbis deliberately made an attempt to excise some of the superstitious practices of Babylonian Jewry. That's a study unto itself. It really is. We know it from archaeology. Have you ever heard of magic bowls? Okay, so the next time you're in Israel, go to the Israel National Library or go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and learn about a big part of archaeological evidence from the Babylonian Jewry period when the Gemara is being written, is that every Jew, in addition to having a mezuzah on his door, had amulets and had magic bowls.
Wow.
Now, what is a magic bowl? It's where you eat your Lucky Charms from, right? That's a magic bowl.
It's a surprise.
Right, yeah.
That's not
A magic bowl was
Bottomless children.
a bowl that had incantations inscribed all around the outside of and the inside of the bowl, in the same way that an amulet had incantations, words that don't mean anything but are permutations of different letters that were meant to ward off evil spirits. There is not a single mention of magic bowls in Talmud Bavli. Talmud Bavli does talk about kameot, talk about amulets, but completely excises magic bowls, even though it was a widespread practice in the Jewish community.
Where would they put them?
They would put them somewhere in their house, and it was meant to drive away evil spirits. But what one of the things that you understand from this is that there was a halachic system that the rabbis were intent on preserving and integrating it with religious practice. The Gemara quite often does say, Puk chazi mai amadavar, go out and see what people are doing, meaning that many times the common practice would help define the prevailing halacha. But at the same time, if there was something that was the rabbis deemed to be completely off the playing board, because it came from such a totally foreign source, many times one of the ways of excising it from religious practice is to ignore it, is to just say, we don't reckon with that.
But amulets go on today too. You have them throughout the centuries. Amulets, yeah.
Some communities have kept up the practice of amulets.
To write this stuff.
Yeah. So amulets in certain communities have continued. If you remember from our Choshen Mishpat discussion, we even had a Choshen Mishpat shaila about a guy who has an amulet, and it was written just for him. And then he asked his friend to watch it, and his friend lost it. What is his liability?
Yeah.
And so Rav Shraga, Sephardi posek, had said, if an item only has value to one person and is completely valueless to everyone else, then you can't assess damages. Right? What is,
Yeah.
you can only assess damages based on market value. But if something has no market value because it's an amulet that works only for me, then you can't really assess damages.
No sentimental value. So it's a
Sentimental value is not taken into account when assessing damages. Okay, so getting back.
One question about what we did before, or was this something that was instituted later on? But the idea about coming earlier to shul as combining mincha.
Yeah, so the Gemara doesn't actually give that as the reason, although it certainly stands to reason that would also be part of the reason why people would daven early. Although you could say daven right before the Shkia and then daven right after the Shkia. But maybe that also would not be acceptable because that's already getting dark, and maybe that would be difficult for people to do because out of fear of the mazikin. Okay, so therefore, what this Gemara is suggesting is contrary to what we saw previously. Rebbe Yassa was of the opinion that there's no need, when you're reciting Kriyat Shema at night, there's no need to make it adjacent to your falling asleep. And that's why he said, listen, recite Kriyat Shema, go to the Beis Medrash and learn as much as you want, and then go to bed. He said, that's fine. This Gemara is saying, no, even if you recited Kriyat Shema earlier in the evening, you have to recite it again to create an adjacency between your Kriyat Shema and your going to sleep. Now, Milsei Amra, so from these words that he just said, we can infer She'ena Omer Devarim Achar Emes V'Yatziv, that you're not allowed to say anything after you say the concluding paragraph, the concluding blessing after Kriyat Shema. Right? That's what we're inferring from this, is that's the reason why you have to recite Kriyat Shema right before you go to bed. Now, Milsei de Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmeni Amra Kain, and from the following story of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmeni, we can also infer this. So basically, what we're seeing is a machlokes, and now we're going to bring a story that's going to support the latter position. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmeni could have anachis li'ibura. When Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmeni would go to help calculate whether the new year required an added month, this was during the time where they would manually calculate every year whether the new year needed to have a 13th month added to it, and he would join, and he would so have a makabel gabe Rabbi Yaakov Garosa. He would go to Rabbi Yaakov Garosa. I'm not sure what does that name mean. The Rash Sarilio in footnote 6 says, I've never heard of that name, Garosa. What is the word Garosa? He would make coarsely ground wheat, meaning like groats or not groats, like the coarse cereal. Grits maybe, grosa maybe. Anyway,
Gross.
it was gross. Yeah. He went to.
It sounds Italian.
He would lodge with Rabbi Yaakov Garosa, and Vahava Rebbe Zera mitamer beinai kupaya mishmana hechava karishma. And so this Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmeni would hide behind the large baskets where Rabbi Yaakov Garosa was sleeping to listen, to hear how he conducted himself before going to bed and how he would recite Kriyat Shema. Okay? Now, by the way, the Gemara in the Bavli also talks about this concept of students sneaking in to their teachers' homes, hiding under the bed or wherever it was, so that they could find out how their masters comported themselves to understand how halacha worked.
Lock your doors.
Yes, yes, I do every night. And so, yes, I'm not so much worried about the mazikin, but I'm worried about.
Congregants.
So, can you imagine if that was a real fear like today? Gosh.
Hello.
Yeah. So, but the phrase, what? But the phrase was Torahi ulalamda anitzarich. The student, the rabbi would say, "You're here? What are you doing here?" And the student would say, "It's Torah, and I need to learn Torah. So that's why I came to observe you." And there's no response in the Gemara. So apparently that was the acceptable argument. Okay, but in any event, so he went to listen to how his Rebbe was reciting Kriya Shema before he went to bed. V'havakari v'chazar v'kari adahavashaka minei goshinte. And so surprisingly, Rebbe Yaakov Garosa would repeatedly recite Kriya Shema until he would finally be overcome with sleep. In other words, he recited Shema, but he was still, he still wasn't tired yet. So he recited it again. It's like counting sheep. Kept reciting Kriya Shema twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, until finally he fell asleep. Now, is there anything wrong with reciting Kriya Shema multiple times? Well, there is a Mishnah in Maseches Brachos that says, Ha'omer Shema Shema Mishaskenosa, that if a person says Shema multiple times, we silence him because it almost sounds like he's praying to 2 separate deities. So it depends on how you recite Shema. Right. If you say Shema, Shema, Yisrael, Yisrael, then that's a problem. But if you say the whole Shema, whether it's just the whole first paragraph or all 3 paragraphs, and then you say the whole thing again, nothing wrong with it. Just like you could recite Tehillim multiple times. You could recite paragraphs of biblical scripture as much as you like. There's no prohibition about that.
As opposed to Shmona Esrei.
Well, as opposed to making any bracha that you've already made, including Shmona Esrei, that you would not be allowed to do. So what he noted, what Reb Shmuel Bar Nachmani noted, why is my Rebbe reciting Kriya Shema repeatedly until he falls asleep? Like, can you imagine? He falls asleep in the middle of the pasuk. That sounds like what would happen. And then, he just kept saying it until he finally fell asleep. But he did that because his shita was, you can't have any interruption between Shema and your sleep to protect you from the mazikin who could potentially attack you, God forbid, while you're asleep, while you're unconscious.
Is it in between that period of time, between while you're saying Shema and when you fall asleep? So after you fall asleep, you're good to go.
After you fall, well, you can't be reciting Kriya Shema while you're sleeping, right? So this is where the OCD comes in. You got to be very careful about it.
Remember as kids, about Basur Daber, and I used to say, okay, I'm talking, you don't have to.
So you'll see that this is actually when we look at the Shulchan Aruch, we're going to see this codified. There is an opinion in the Shulchan Aruch that says you're not allowed to speak after you say the Shema, Kriyat Shema Lamita, and you say, you say Hamapil, you say the bracha of Hamapil, which is the final bracha at the end of Kriyat Shema Lamita, Hamir L'Olam Kol B'Chvado, and then you can't speak afterwards. But what if you get up and you're hungry? What if you get, So for years, I was very disturbed by this halacha until I found the Abu Dirham, who's a medieval commentary on the Siddur, Rabbi David Abu Dirham, and he actually ends up disagreeing with the Shulchan Aruch. And it's one of the few instances where I've taken the liberty of digressing from the standard psak. And I do allow myself to speak. But what is his basis for saying that? He says that there's another Gemara that says that if you're going to be intimate with your wife, you have to engage in foreplay. You have to engage in romantic words before you engage your wife in intimacy. And if you've already recited Kriya Shema, and you detect that she's amorous or that you have an urge, what are you going to say?
That's very romantic.
That's not appropriate.
Pass notes back.
That's not, it's like,
We pass notes back and forth.
that's totally inappropriate in a loving relationship. So based on that, the Abu Dirham says, contrary to what some authorities say, including this Gemara, you are allowed to speak after your Kriya Shema Lamita. And he proves it from that, because how would you be allowed to speak to your wife, right? And you can't say, well, you have to plan marital intimacy in advance. Honey, I plan to say Kriya Shema Lamita. What do you think? Should we or shouldn't we? Right? That's not a very romantic thing. And Judaism does not, there may be people who are very, very religious and very
Pious.
they're very, very, very pious. That's a good word. And may feel extremely directed towards doing everything according to the letter of the law, even at the expense of spontaneous romance. But I guess for whatever shortcomings that I have, that's not me. And I don't subscribe to that. I don't feel that that's healthy for a marriage.
But what would be the point of not talking? What is the whole story behind it?
No interruptions.
It's like saying a bracha before doing a mitzvah. It's
But you've said it.
you've said hamapil. You want to be able to retain the spiritual energy and the purity of that bracha and create an adjacency to the act of sleeping, because the purpose of the Shema and the bracha that comes after is to protect you and to enter into sleep in that state of kedusha.
Not until a modani, you're allowed to talk.
That's according to some opinions.
Well, Rabbi, we're
It's not-
still returning the word neshama to Hashem, and we're thinking to Hashem for.
Yeah.
Returning the neshama to
Yeah, I
Hashem.
mean,
We're thinking for giving
there
what
is there is a virtue to it. It's not like we're not saying it's completely absurd. There's definitely a virtue to it, and there's a value to it. But again, a person has to weigh multiple factors, right? And it's not just being mopsic. Like if you've already said Kriya Shema Lamita and you've already said Hamapil, and then you go on your phone and you start, scrolling
Yes.
and watching videos, then that's probably.
Yeah, it's not
As
just
long as
sleeping.
you're not talking.
I mean, I was gonna just suggest picking up a book and reading it to try to
Yeah.
fall asleep, but
Yeah.
it's all this, anything can't just be just talking, because it's anything that's.
Well, so you see, now we don't paskin like this, Rabbi Yaakov
Right.
Garosa. We don't have to keep reciting Kriya Shema
Until you fall asleep.
again and again and again until you fall asleep. But you see that this was the value. Go ahead.
Instead of Shema, did you learn Torah?
Yeah, so
Shema,
you could make the argument that I want to preserve the holiness of that bracha, so I'll learn Torah until I fall asleep. That is a very valuable thing to do. It's a very virtuous thing to do. And we would encourage people to
Yeah.
do
But we
that.
stay on
You
stage or
dress
not.
properly. You have to dress properly to learn Torah.
Well,
You're in bed.
I mean, as long as you're covered, I suppose it's okay. And even if you're not, as long as you have today we have elastic bands around our pajama pants usually. I mean, unless, yeah, I'm not going to question your sleeping habits, but as
We're
long
not
as.
gonna come over to check it out.
Yeah.
Just check
Yeah.
out the.
But I still wear whatchamacallit, boxer shorts when I go to bed in an undershirt. So there's no problem, because the elastic creates a separation between the bottom part of your body and the top part of your body. So you can certainly learn Torah. Okay, we'll continue this in Mirza Hashem.
We say that say tonight, you should fall asleep. Like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.